So all too often I hear guys going out during that perfect time of the year when that water temp is 60, 72 degrees, those fish are spawning, and they're just talking about not catching fish or catching just small fish and not even numbers of them. And what I want to talk about is why is that. If that's one of you guys, I'm going to break down why you're not getting big bites and why you're not catching the numbers of fish that you should be catching during the spawn. So at a certain point in the year when those fish start to get shallow, there comes a time when those fish really stop keying in on moving baits. You know, guys are throwing chatterbaits, spinnerbaits, crankbaits, and you'll go from catching big fish and a bunch of fish to all of a sudden you're not getting bit. And there's a couple different reasons for that. One of the main reasons is pressure. You know, those fish come from going out in the deep water, coming shallow, they're fresh, they haven't really seen a ton of baits, and so they're eating, getting in that pre-spawn period where they're just feeding up, getting ready for the spawn. And so they're chewing on everything, you get the right conditions, and you're catching a ton of fish, right? It's one of my absolute favorite times of year. And then all of a sudden, it stops. And nobody really knows why. Everybody's like, oh man, I was crushing them on a chatterbait last week right here, and I don't know what happened. Oh man, I was crushing them on a swimbait last week, and all of a sudden it just stopped. Well, that water gets to a certain point when those fish no longer are thinking about spawning, they're actually doing it. And so that's one of the other reasons they're not eating that anymore, is they're not trying to feed up anymore, they're trying to get it on. They're trying to make love, they're trying to, you know, produce offspring, and they're focusing on spawning and they're focusing on their beds. And so what ends up happening is guys are just straight up fishing over top of them. Those fish might even come up, look at it, and go back down, but if the water's a little dingy and you can't see, you have no idea that fish was even there. Or they might bump it, but you're just going to fish over top of those fish over and over and over again. And I see it happen all the time. And it's a pretty abrupt stop. Once that water hits that certain temperature and you get a full moon, you get a new moon, you get the right conditions, or 3 or 4 days of consistent warm weather in a row, and those fish are on beds. And it's more predominant in the south than it is in the north, because in the south you get bigger waves of fish versus up north we get like 1 or 2 waves of fish and it's done. And the spawn up here, I'm up in Erie, PA, the largemouth spawn lasts like a week and then it's done, unless we get like a major weather pattern. But down south, they get multiple waves of fish. So you'll still catch a fish here and a fish there, and that's what keeps people throwing those moving baits, is that, well, I caught a 4-pounder, but I caught a 2-pounder, but they're not catching the numbers. It goes from catching a 4, a 5, a 3, a bunch of 2.5s to all of a sudden you're getting like a 4, a skinny 2.5, and you're just not getting the fish. And it's because they're locked on beds, or they're just in that period where they're up there shallow on that cover trying to spawn. And so what you have to do is you have to make that transition from throwing those chatterbaits and those spinnerbaits and those swim baits to throwing wacky rigs, throwing, flipping baits, throwing a drop shot up there shallow, throwing those slower moving baits like a shaky head like I talked about in my last video. Throwing those slower moving baits to really pick off those fish. And there's probably no better one than a Senko out there. This is a Z-Man Senko. It works really good. It has a super slow fall rate. And that's what's really key, because those fish are up there in 2, maybe a foot of water. So, you get a lot of fish out in 3 feet of water still spawning, but you have to get in those areas where those fish are spawning and just straight up slow down. And it's painful, and that's what tricks a lot of people, because nobody likes to fish slow most of the time. They want to get those big bites on the chatterbaits and all the fun baits that those fish eat and cover a ton of water. And so you have to make that transition to slow down. And the areas that I want to talk about are areas to key in on and the types of cover that you're going to be looking for. So what you want to do is you want to get in shallow protected bays. You either want to get in those shallow protected bays that are close to the main lake, because that's where you're going to get your biggest numbers of fish and your big fish, or you want to get in just protected areas that have a lot of cover around. Things like stumps, cypress trees for you southern guys, laydowns, or just inside grass. If you can get some, some hard grassy cover, some reeds, something along those lines that those fish can get on hard bottom, which is key. Sandy bottom a lot of times is the most key thing. And even shallow grass, they'll spawn in the holes in the grass. And you'll go from catching them on a chatterbait to all of a sudden you got to throw that Senko in there and let it fall in those holes in the grass. But you'll be surprised, you'll go from catching no fish on a chatterbait, pick up a Senko, throw it in every hole in the grass that you see, and go from catching 2 to 5 fish a day to catching 50 to 100 fish a day. It's just lights out like that. And it's the same thing down south. It's the same thing everywhere you go. You'll go from catching 5, 6 fish a day to catching 50 fish a day just by making that transition to slow down. So getting in those shallow bays where that's protected from north winds specifically, that is the key thing, and getting on those banks that the sun is going to be on the most, and finding the isolated cover that sticks out to you. Now when I say sticks, I could just say sticks out, but that's going to be different for everybody in every type of cover. So what you want to do is look for the normal pieces of cover. Say you're going down a brush line and all of a sudden there's one bush that sticks out a foot further. That's where they're going to be. Or if you're going through some reeds and all of a sudden there's a hole in the reeds, that's where they're going to be. You know, you're going around anything that looks isolated, those fish are going to spawn on. Remember, they have to have sunlight on those eggs, so don't be pitching it underneath stuff necessarily. You know, you still catch some fish, maybe some post-spawn fish or some pre-spawn fish up there shallow, but if you're fishing for those beds and you're getting up there shallow, try to find those areas that sunlight can hit that's right next to cover. And that's going to be how you're going to get more bites and how you're going to keep catching big fish. So like I said, a lot of guys don't like to make that transition to these slower moving baits, but one of the best baits that you can throw is a shaky head, and I just did a video on that. I'll have that linked up here so you guys can check that out so you can understand the gear that I throw a shaky head on. As always, I'll have the baits that I've talked about linked down below. But God bless you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and y'all take care.